Good morning, everyone. I bring greetings from Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk Territory. I'm from Kahnawake. I'm also, I've been very fortunate to have been working at Carleton for the last year as a guest as well of the Algonquin people. So Nyawatgoa for looking after me so well. Also as well, I just thought I might say too that I'll be here in the longer term. I'm now transitioning into assistant professorship at Carleton, so it's all good. So what I want to speak to you about today is, I want to actually take you way back to point of contact. I think that's an important place to start. The issue of Indigenous women who have gone missing or have been murdered is something that is not new. It's actually been taking place since the time of contact. What's important to recognize is that there's two things here. One is the systemic racism that perpetuates the problem, which is what we'll go into a little bit today, but as well, what is the individual role in this, and that leads directly to how women, Indigenous women, are perceived in the wider society. So what I'm looking at today is the second part. I'm bringing you way back to so that you can recognize that when you're walking through the mall or you're walking through stores and you see those shirts with those stereotypical images, or you see those Pocahontas costumes sitting on the shelves, you recognize that that has something to do with this issue and that you can actually do something about it. So we can recognize that we need to dialogue. We need to continue to talk about this issue, and the first place to start is to dialogue with yourself, to be critically engaged, and that's what I'm going to encourage you to do today: is be critically engaged with yourself and your role in this, because I think the issue is much bigger than us as individuals, but collectively, if we recognize within ourselves our personal responsibilities to learn, to teach others, and then to, of course, teach our children and our family members, and you have this, what we notice, what we call a ripple effect. So it's like dropping a pebble into a body of water, right? It starts and it ripples outward. So it starts today with the individual. So we have to ask ourselves, why is this issue not an important one, or why has it not been important? But it has been important. It's been important to Indigenous peoples. It's just that our voices have not been heard. Our women have remained nameless and faceless until now. As you notice, more recently, in the last couple of years, we've seen more faces and names in media sources and Indigenous faces and Indigenous names in media sources when women go missing or have been murdered. Before then, very few and far between. Those who were reported on were the non-Native women. So we're beginning to see these names and these faces more and more often. And this has been going on for a very long time. What I want to illustrate with you is that we have two different worldviews that are playing out in this issue as well. Right from the point of contact, the Eurocentric perspective on the world was imposed on our people and imposed on how our people, Indigenous peoples, were perceived. If we look to the Aboriginal worldview, we construct the world in terms of circles. It's a cyclical nature: life, death, rebirth, and it relates to the interconnectedness of all things. So when we talk about our women who have gone missing or have been murdered, they may not be related to me by blood, but they are interconnected to me through the very fact that they are women and they are my sisters no matter what. Also, too, the idea of the collectivity and the relationship to community, that is so important. So when one woman goes missing or is murdered, we are all related. She is one of ours, and we feel it just as much as those family members do. As well, the relationship with the environment. We are very connected to the environment. As women, we are the progenitors. We have that ability to bring forth new life like the natural world. And that constructs how we view the world and how we relate to each other in our communities. As well, we see ourselves then as the caretakers of the land. So when a woman goes missing, that's one less structure, that's one less caretaker. And of course, the male and female unity here. We have to recognize that, yes, many things have happened to Indigenous women since the time of contact, but so they have also happened to men as well. And there's that interconnectedness that has been broken through the imposition of residential schools and the Indian Act system on our peoples. If we look to the Eurocentric worldview, it's linear, it's up, top, down. The idea of the individuality rather than the community is paramount. You have this hierarchy that takes place, the fear of the unknown, so that the environment, when we look to the destruction of the environment today, this is what I'm talking about, is the fear of the unknown, the domination of the unknown, the domination of the environment. As well, the idea of land ownership rather than being caretakers of the land. And of course, the male and female binary, males and females being put into their two separate spheres and having no interconnectedness, whereas in the Indigenous worldview, we are very much interconnected. So what I want to impart with you then today is that it's important to realize that we all have a role to play, males and females, and that we are all interconnected, and we can all speak to one another about this issue. So, relating very directly then, we recognize then that the individual here, males and females, it's important to recognize your individual agency in this issue. Be aware, become aware of what's going on, become aware of those things that you see in the mall, those movies that you play for your children, the movies that you take your children to, the images out there. And because really what we can say is that we only know ourselves. And if we know ourselves well enough and recognize that we are promoting this issue through showing movies like Pocahontas to our children, then we have to stop that. But I wanted to take you quickly back to contact. I know it's a long time ago, but it's important to recognize, and I think that's one thing that people don't realize when they're talking about this issue, is that it does go that far back. And we know that because we look at the early images of contact. Okay, so you see the hypersexualized, the violent images that are portrayed of Indigenous peoples as killers, as the idea of the noble savage. You know, these are the images that were constructed, and they directly relate to that Eurocentric perspective that was imposed on Indigenous peoples. It directly relates to how, you know, throughout society it's permeated so much to the, you know, and how people, to the point that it constructs how people relate to Indigenous peoples, and most specifically here today to Indigenous women. You have this idea of the noble savage, the idea of savage being something as supremely violent. But if we look to the Indigenous perspective, we're not violent people. We are very peace-loving. We are very much about relationship with the environment, caretakers, all of that I've tried to impart with you. But most specifically with early representations of women, you have them hypersexualized. So these visually represent how our women were perceived to be outside, othered. They were othered. They weren't seen as valuable members of our communities. And who gets to write history here? The colonizers do. So the history doesn't even contain stories, the true stories and this true knowledge about the role, the most specific role of Indigenous women. The only way that I know is because of what's been passed down through the oral narratives. But a lot of that is missing because who wrote history were the males, and they weren't allowed into our purview. They weren't allowed into our world by the very fact that they were males. So a lot of that history was not written. But also too, then, their view on women, the Eurocentric perspective on women was imposed on how they viewed our people. So in 1575, you have the idea of the Amazon queen, okay, and there's images of, there's ideas and words like queen and princess and squaw that I'm going to talk about that relate very directly to this issue. And she's represented as a hypersexualized, a pale woman, you know, in a noble position. The idea in 1700 of the Indian princess, okay? So there's an evolution of an idea of an idea of what Indigenous women are about. And they're othered, they're taken out of their context. They're removed from their traditional settings, so much so that they become Europeanized or civilized, as we shall say. Now, the most stark representation of this idea is come to play out in the idea of Pocahontas. And you recognize her. She's hypersexualized. She's got, you know, a very built physique. This is not who she was. As the story goes, she was given as a gift, and her agency in her own community, where she sat side by side with her father and watched all of the diplomacy going on and understood the politics that were happening. I mean, understood her role in it, has been missing from the historical narrative. That's not what you hear, and that's not what you see. So if you look to this, the image on the left side, that's the only known representation of Pocahontas that exists, and that's nothing like what we see in the Pocahontas movie. Also, too, you have this idea of the squaw, this hypersexualized Indigenous woman. And we hear a lot of, you know, there's a lot of places in North America that are named Squaw Mountain, Squaw Hill, you know, different areas. And those speak to this kind of history that's been taking place, that's been playing out in North America for a long time. But she's to be dominated, the squaw, the idea of the squaw is that she's an Indigenous woman that's to be dominated, that can be, she's othered, she's no longer herself, she's no longer coming from the Indigenous culture where we don't hypersexualize. Sex is not something that you would relate to in the way that we think of it now. It is something to be cherished and nurtured, whereas these women, the negative notions of sex that we take on in society today are imposed on our women. And so you see these kinds of images and you hear these kinds of terms used to describe our women, which is very harmful. This also plays out in the idea of the Indian princess for sale, where she was portrayed on cigarette packages and Land O'Lakes butter tins throughout the 1950s and the 1940s. So she's once again hypersexualized, half-dressed, her skin is lightened. So these are the images that our family members, our parents, our grandparents grew up with. These are the images that have permeated society and constructed the way that we view the Indigenous women. And so how does that play out? It plays out in the stereotypes, in how Indigenous peoples are represented in film and in sports, with regards to the naming of sports teams, the proliferation of costumes at Halloween. If you do a Google search and you do Native American women on Google, this is what comes up. This is the body of images that comes up in that first page. And look at, if you can pay attention then to the hypersexualization of these Indigenous women and the images that you see. Also the idea of the mascots, the stereotypes that have permeated throughout. So of course we have the other aspect of it, which is the impacts of colonization and Canadian legislation on Indigenous peoples, where you have the marginalization of women and traditional roles in history. You have the residential schooling impacts, and I'm not going to go into that, but very clearly what we find is that the role of women has been devalued, deconstructed, and we're just beginning to relearn how to be part of our communities again and do things as women again that we're supposed to, like raising our children, educating one another. Also the idea of female Indian identity under the Indian Act, the sexualization of women's identity, how women have been excluded and marginalized through this body of legislation. So throughout, if we're looking at the whole big picture then, our women have remained voiceless and faceless in history and leading right up until modern day society. So how does this relate to the wider image of, or the wider issue here that we're talking about, the Indigenous women who've gone missing or have been murdered or have been victimized, is that these images are what construct how people perceive our women, and therefore they can be violence can be inflicted upon them because they are nothing. They are seen as nothing. They are not valued. So we have, now they're saying over 1,500 cases, but this has been going on for so long that there's many that have remained nameless and faceless. We have to consider that these are of women who are registered members, registered Indians with Indian status. What about all those other women who lost their status or didn't even have status because of enfranchisement or various other issues? They are part of the numbers too. So the number we have to recognize is a lot larger than we think and that we recognize. So what is at play here then is a learned behavior that has to be unlearned. And that's how people relate to, specifically to Indigenous people, but also to the women, and see them as valued. Just even if you see them on the street and they're begging for money, they were at one time valued members of our communities, and that has to be recognized. The systemic inequalities that are taking place, as well, the idea that they won't be missed. They are missed. That's what we're here today. We talk about these women, even though they're gone, they are still part of our families and part of our communities. And so this combination of the impacts from colonization and this learned behaviors places women in these dangerous spaces that we have to recognize are dangerous, and that we have to change those kinds of spaces. And how do we do that? It's through, on our part as Indigenous women and Indigenous peoples, it's a reinvigoration of our traditions and our ways of doing and ways of being that will provide a clear and strong framework to ensure that we strengthen our relationship to the land, our relationship to our communities, and acknowledge our human right to our body sovereignty, and that that our bodies remain free from violation and suffering. So are there solutions? I think that's what we're going to be asking today, is perhaps there is a middle ground. We're asking for a national inquiry, but perhaps there's a middle ground if that's too large of an issue. It's just a matter of dialoguing on this to figure out, okay, what is that middle ground? Where can that dialogue happen so that we can begin to talk to one another and with each other and come to find a solution together? Fairer funding models for health and education, most specifically related to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women. That we need to make policing organizations accountable for all of those cases, for ignoring those cases of those women. That would include the ones that are not registered. And as well, coming up with some sort of a national strategy out of a national inquiry. So not letting recommendations sit on the shelf like they did with RCAP, and nothing has been done. We need to actually, once we have an idea of where we need to go and the future, the direction that we're heading, we need to do something about it and keep that momentum going. So what would we learn through an inquiry that we don't already know? Where did we drop the ball? There should be a positive, collaborative, respectful response to what is a deep-rooted social issue. And it might identify then instances in which Indigenous women were treated differently by the authorities. So it's going to bring to light all of these things that we're talking about in a more concrete way. And to give us legal clout to gain access to the files so that those women don't remain nameless and faceless. We can actually put names and faces to those women that have gone missing or have been murdered. And then also to bring people forward, to force people to come forward if they're subpoenaed and to testify, rather than letting them sit and we will have the opportunity to ask them to be accountable. So, what am I time at? What is my time at? It's good? Okay. So that's all. I just wanted to say that, think about yourselves, be critically engaged with yourself. Be aware of your role in this. I know it's a big issue. It seems a lot bigger than all of us this few of us sitting here today. It is, but if we start with the individual and we start within ourselves to try to figure out what can I do, how can I teach someone, one person, what this issue is about, that one person's going to teach someone else, and it'll go on and on and on. So I just wanted to say thank you for listening to me. Nyawakoa.